Let's welcome Dr. Osterstock.
Very good. Thank you, Walt. Yeah, so as Walt mentioned a couple weeks ago, I had to fill in. My boss was supposed to give a presentation, and because of flight difficulties, which I'm sure some of us are becoming more and more familiar with, I had to step in. I'll have to give away the secret, though, is when you make the presentation for your boss, then it's much easier for you to give the presentation for your boss. At any rate, pleasure to be here today. It's been a while since I've been to Sioux Falls area, and obviously a great opportunity for me to reconnect with a lot of folks here. I saw Lindsay Warden, who I collaborate with extensively in our partnership with the Holstein Association today, and just a great time for fellowship and catching up with everyone. So hopefully we can get a chance to say hello to one another as we go through the day. I guess maybe before we start, I'll just provide a bit of background on myself. I'm a veterinarian and epidemiologist and have spent time studying genetics and working with Zoetis and legacy companies now for 12 years in this space. And as was mentioned today, I manage the Precision Animal Health Group. And wanted to provide a little bit of context there because I think our approach to how we're looking at data and precision animal health is very similar to how we would encourage you to start thinking about it. Within precision animal health, that includes our global genetics business, but it also includes our work in dairy data analytics. It includes software solutions for feeding management, health management, financial management. It also includes precision medicine and how we're using multi-omics technologies to help understand individualized care. And I think our evolution on that journey from being really pure play or point solution focused on genetics to now having a bit more diverse perspective, multi-technology oriented business, I think is an example of the same type of evolution as dairy producers you need to go through as well. The other thing I'd mention too is, and it's interesting having Dr. Overton speak before me, so one of the things, and apologies, I'm going to date you a little bit, Doc, but as I mentioned, I'm a veterinarian. I graduated from Ohio State University and actually did an externship at the VMTRC in Tulare. And Dr. Overton was the senior faculty member at the time that took care of us. And I'm sure I haven't paid him enough to keep him from telling all the stories about me as a young veterinarian during that externship experience. But the thing I remember is, at that time, we were really trained in this concept of preventive medicine and herd health, right? And herd health during that era was really, I don't call it the rage, because it wasn't a fad, right? But it was fundamentally the approach that was really quite prominent during that period. And it was largely driven by the fact that as herd sizes expanded, we did not have the luxury of practicing individual animal medicine in the same way that we might have historically. And so we had to think about managing populations, managing the health of populations, and tackling it from that perspective. And it's interesting now, here 20 years later, for us to look at how we're starting to drive back to that individual cow through the use of technology. So really inspiring time for me as a veterinarian, but also as a stakeholder in the industry. So going to start off quickly. It was funny, Dr. Bewley talking about internet access. I also live in a rural area, and we have internet challenges. And one of the things that we struggle with at home is Netflix, right? We can get through about maybe a week worth of Netflix before we have burned through all of our bandwidth. And it's interesting, as you think about Netflix, I'm not sure if any of y'all are Netflix users or Amazon Prime users. Any of y'all share your accounts with your kids, right? And so like you finally have an opportunity, it's early enough in the month that it works, and you have an opportunity to log in, and you can tell that your kids have been using your account, right? Because now all of a sudden, instead of the, war movies or sports movies like I usually watch, I've got cartoons, Bluey, and other stuff, and I can tell my 8-year-old has been using my account to be watching Netflix. It's interesting as you think about what actually goes on behind the scenes to shape then those recommendations that are showing up on my queue, because it thinks that now all of a sudden my pattern of the shows that I enjoy has fundamentally changed from where it was last month. And if you think about all of the analytics and the logic that goes on behind the scenes there, It's really interesting to start to translate that into how we think about cows and what they're telling us on a daily basis, and how that should be shaping at a very individualized level what we want to do with them, how we help them, right? And how we anticipate their needs. And it's very much the same journey. And I'd encourage you to, as we go through this presentation, we're going to talk a lot about mindset and perspectives, and it's really think of those examples where technology is influencing other aspects of your life as you think about how do you maximize the value of the technology investments that you're making within your respective herds. From a mindset perspective, I perceive a bit of a dilemma here. As a dairy industry, and really I think many of the animal agriculture industries, we have the same dilemma in that there are really two ways that we can think about decision making. One is intuition-based decision making, and as an industry that's steeped in tradition and heritage, that values the passing down of experiences from more senior members of our family or of our organization to the next generation. We really embrace that. And I think in many respects, that intuition, relying on our gut, strongly influences how we think about decision-making on farm. Alternatively, if we look at data-driven decision-making, right, I think there's a lot of examples where we practice that. And I think our 100-year history of milk recording, of genetic selection, of how we utilize herd management software systems. It's interesting, one of the businesses that I manage is our performance livestock analytics business, which is focused on feeding software and health management software for beef cattle producers. And in many instances, the transition that we're making there is from pen to paper. We're put down the big chief tablet, right, or put down the calving book and let's start to record this in a digital way. And so, we still have a lot of aspects of animal agriculture where we're making that big leap. Dairy's not in that same boat. We're collecting a wealth of information and we use a lot of data. But I think it's an appropriate balance here of how do we rely on intuition and experience, but also recognize that data-driven decision-making is inherently less risky. It does a better job of anticipating future needs. And I think that's really how we need to think about the use of data is in shaping those decisions. And I think there's lots of great examples of that. I included one of my favorite charts from the Holstein Association, the Pulse magazine, from Dr. Lawler, where he looked at herds he had ranked herds based on their TPI values, right? Their average herd TPI value. And then said from those herds, and I think it was 2016, sorry, with the slides that's that far away, my glasses won't let me read it, but several years, tracked them over several years, and what he found was that the herds that had the higher average genetic values were the ones that were much more likely to still be in business in 2018, right? So this is a great way of empirical evaluation of how genetics then correlates to other aspects of herd management, herd profitability, and ultimately herd survival. So really interesting graph that helps to emphasize the point of this evidence-based decision making. So one of the things that I think is really important then as we move through this journey of saying, okay, we've got an appetite for more data, we think we have some perspective on how we're going to utilize it, and we also recognize I've got a lot of different data sources, right? So in a very simplistic way, one could leave the session today and say we've been exposed to ear tag-based sensors, a rumen bolus, a herd management software system, a financial management system, and so that's basically the array of apps that are now on my phone, right? But I think it's imperative that we start to break down the silos, if you will, pun intended, break down the silos in our data. And don't think about genetics data for genetics things and nutrition data for nutrition things and parlor data for parlor things, right? We really need to start thinking about how does all of this data come together as part of a data ecosystem. And I like the example of saying, who's the chief information officer for your dairy? Because you very much need to have someone that's helping to make sure that all of your data sources are working seamlessly together. And it's the value at the intersection of those disparate data sources that is the key to unlocking the future of dairy production. It's not the point solution and stacking point solutions. It's extracting the value at the interface of technology A and technology B, or system A and system B. Just to provide a bit of an example here, as I mentioned, we work in the genetics business, and I've got a long history in genetics, and I think one of the things that we recognize is that we are, in many respects, an information business as we think about genetic testing services. And as an information business, we know our product is valuable to the extent that it can influence or shape or improve a decision. And therefore, the more decisions I can make with a given piece of data, right, the more valuable now that data has become. Fundamentally, this is why we don't typically test adult cows with a genetic test, because we've already made the majority of the decisions that matter, right? At that point, we've already decided to keep her. We've already made at least one decision to breed her, right? We've already made a couple decisions along the way that she's still here. And so as a consequence, we just don't have very many choices left where that genetic information is going to be important. It's why we drive those decisions upstream into that young dairy female, where we have a whole lifetime of opportunities to make decisions. So that's part of it. One thinking about timing and the number of decisions we can make. But I think the other part is also not confining ourselves to the classical array of decisions. Now, I'm going to guess that a handful of you have had a conversation with someone around the use of genetic testing as an example, the application of genomic technologies in heifer management, okay? And I'm going to guess that that conversation probably centered largely, and rightfully so, largely on, are we going to select these heifers as replacements? Do they fit where my herd wants to go? Once I've decided I want to keep them, am I going to use sex semen, conventional semen, or beef semen? Am I going to use her as a donor? Am I going to use her as a recipient, right? Which bull should I breed her to? That's the classical array of decisions. But I think it's interesting to also challenge ourselves and think about, what are the other ways we should be using this information? So I would say, first and foremost, don't compartmentalize your decision making. Don't think about genetics data for genetics things, okay? We need to think about where all that data is coming from, what are all of the use cases across the entire array of data sources within our operation. Think about then, what is it that we're trying to do with that data? Are we trying to advise? Are we trying to, maybe it's related to compliance or some certification, process validation, right? Or is it part of a business intelligence solution? Are we trying to use it to manage policy or other things? We talked about sustainability. You know, one of the great things about the dairy industry in terms of our journey on the pathway to sustainability is, to the extent that that has to be rooted in documented production practices, not a problem. We got that. We know how to do that, right? So again, thinking about all of these pieces, bringing them together, and the entire array of solutions and how we might utilize it. I think the other thing that, you know, this is an interesting opportunity and an interesting time for dairy producers, the amount of power that you all have at this moment. And I should, you know, as someone who's potentially on the other side of that influence, right? And maybe need to be careful in coaching you, but the reality is you have tremendous amount of power, right? In saying, show me the value, point solutions aren't enough, and also saying, I expect you to do more with my data. This isn't enough. I'm going to challenge you. If you want me to continue to use that system, right, show me more ways to extract value. Show me how you can take your data and combine it with my other sources and unlock that latent value that exists at the interface between your technology and your competitor's technology, right? That's a tremendous opportunity that you have in front of you, and your voice is remarkably loud in those discussions. And I think I would encourage you to be thinking about how you exert your influence on folks like me to respond to your needs in a more holistic and cohesive way. So one example as we think about alternative use cases, and I know this is a little bit small, so I'm not going to go into details, but we can certainly take genetic information as an example and look at ranking animals into quartiles or something like that, and then tracking their progress over time, looking at the actual outcomes. And I think, as has been mentioned before, and maybe it was in the video with Dr. Boyle, I mean, it's remarkable how accurate these genomic predictions are, which is, not surprisingly, a consequence of how good we are at collecting lots and lots of disease outcomes that inform those genetic predictions. And so as we assess high genetic merit females versus low genetic merit females, we see very clear differences in terms of productivity, but also incidence of disease, the associated cost of those diseases, right? Their survival in the herd. Let's also think about the opportunity that comes along with that. So, has anyone here ever utilized genetic predictions for mastitis to look at those animals that should be at the lowest risk based on genetics, okay? And then tracking whether they're getting sick at a higher rate than you would expect, right? They're almost like a sentinel animal in there, right? This is the one female in here that shouldn't have a problem. DAs are another example. DAs, it's actually surprising. When we look at predictions for displaced abomasum, it's almost scary how well that works. We have difficulty validating those predictions in commercial settings because in the best cohorts of animals, we just don't see any cases at all, which creates problems from a data analysis perspective, right? Well, what that means is if I start to see a DA in cohorts of females that from a genetics perspective should not be getting DAs, it's almost like a sentinel beacon. That's the yellow canary, right, in the coal mine that's telling us, hey, there's a problem here. That's a very different way to utilize genetic information than thinking about breeding decisions. But I think that genetic prediction is absolutely powerful enough to allow us to do that, right? It can tell us about how our management and external factors starting to overwhelm the genetic potential that these cows are bringing to the table, right? So I'd encourage you to start thinking about that, and honestly, we have been doing a lot of that as well. And we're looking at it from the standpoint of we talked about machine learning, AI approaches. There's lots of AI in the dairy industry. Here's another, right? But as we look at precision animal medicine, it's our ability to integrate data from all of these disparate sources into a single analytical stream, and Dr. Bewley referred to this, that's going to become really important. And I think there's some interesting parallels when we look at human health. And I've got a reference here to a company, it's called Renalytics, I think is the name of the company. But what they do is they start with a DNA profile on an individual, and then they start to combine that with biomarkers and other diagnostic tests and then lifetime events, et cetera. Apply then machine learning on top of that to assess what that individual's score is from a total renal health perspective and their risk for chronic renal disease. And then starting to prescribe specific interventions, right? Before anything's gone wrong, we're already proactively managing against that disease risk based on a unification of genetic risk factors, environmental risk factors, and other observations. We're going to start doing the same thing with cows. It's going to be the combination of the weather data, the performance data, the data of other cohorts in her herd, her genetic profile, other diagnostic instruments, all of the things that these sensors are detecting. And we're going to start to, in real time, be managing actively what those risk profiles are for individual cows. And that's going to start shaping different types of interventions that we make as well. And for a company like Zoetis, this actually becomes really important too in thinking about new product development, right? In many respects, I'm not sure if you realize, I mean, the easy drugs have been developed already, right? We've already taken care of that. We're at a point where future innovation for additional diseases, additional indications is going to be exceptionally challenging. It's understanding the individual biological differences between animals that'll unlock our potential to be able to create new products that aren't designed for everyone, but are designed for cows like her. Cows with that genetic profile are particularly suited to benefit from this intervention, right? It's going to be a very different way of thinking about preventive medicine and even treatment. Here's an example of kind of what I'm talking about. So in this example, what we're doing is we're taking underlying genetic information. We understand the genotype of that animal and her genetic predictions for an array of different traits. We're adding all of the data from the herd management software systems. All right, so what are we recording in terms of, how many days in milk is she? What pen is she in? How is the rest of that pen performing? What experience, what did she do last lactation, right? What did other animals in the herd, what are they currently doing? What's the weather currently? What are we seeing, in terms of that? What's any milk test data that we're recording? Putting all of that, it's really a very elegant beef stew in some respects, right? Putting all of those ingredients in together and then creating a single summary estimate of what her real-time risk is. And it is remarkable how accurate those are. And again, this is using, AI approaches. So in the top box, we're looking at predicting the risk of mastitis across lactating cows, and we've categorized them into one of three levels. And what you can see, it's actually good that we don't have equal numbers of animals in each of those groups, right? Because we're not necessarily concerned with managing three different groups. That's actually problematic from a herd management perspective. What I want to do is I want to find who are the select few that I need to pay particular attention to. And what this shows is that in that top group, which out of these 150,000 animals or 150,000 lactations, that 7,500 or so that we identified as having the highest risk had 80% of the mastitis cases, right? With all of this data coming together, it's remarkable how accurate we can be. Same thing, look at the bottom when we talk about reproductive success, right? We can identify animals that, listen, doesn't really matter what you do. You get a straw of semen somewhere in the same zip code as this female, she's going to take care of the rest for you. But here are the ones you really got to pay attention to. And I think that's where we're going to start to see this evolving, and it's very much like Dr. Bewley referred to this morning, that it's the machine learning, the predictive analytics, and layering that on top with then some very specific recommendations for what we do to help those animals along the balance of their journey. That's the direction that we're going. And I think, that, again, the opportunity for you is to help shape our thinking and understanding, here are the needs, here are the pinch points. As I think about labor, here are the problems that are most difficult for me to manage with my current labor force, right? And really directing all the various stakeholders and companies and the technologies that are represented here in that journey. Now, when we have these conversations around data analytics, Internet of Things, et cetera, one of the things that always comes up is around data rights, data usage, et cetera. Now, fortunately, the lawyers aren't going to make a lot of money because cows don't have data rights themselves, but you as a producer, we recognize the work, the investment, and the rights that you have to that data. And I think it's important that you are responsible in how you utilize that data and think about who you will share that data with. But at the same time, I think it's also important that you embrace the opportunity to share that data, because there are a lot of technologies, a lot of analytics that are able to really help you unlock insights that are valuable to your organization through sharing it and through asking your different providers to share data with one another, right? Again, tremendous power that you possess in this equation. And so I think as we move forward, be responsible and vigilant, but also be opportunistic and take advantage of those scenarios where you can share the information. So with that, again, thank you very much for your attention today and the opportunity to be here. Again, I think you're in a really fantastic position as a dairy producer to exert influence, to be creative, and there's a lot of great stuff that's coming that'll fundamentally change the way we dairy moving forward. So thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Osterstock. We have a little bit of time for questions. One question I wanted to ask was for herds that are somewhere on that spectrum between intuitive decision-making and data decision-making, and I think in the room here we could find probably a wide spectrum of that. What tips do you have to kind of move from that intuitive to the data decision? What helps that transition go more smoothly?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, great question, and I guess I'll answer that maybe by sharing a bit of a management philosophy that I have. So when I look within my teams that I lead within Zoetis, one of the things that I'm very deliberate about doing is creating groups that are very diverse, right? I intentionally bring folks with very disparate experiences together to help complement one another. I'm not someone that likes having groupthink or where everybody comes from the same background. So I think the first thing would be have some awareness of who you are as an individual in terms of how you make decisions, but also have an awareness of other team members, your veterinarian, your nutritionist, your financial advisor, and you should try to look for opportunities to bring folks to the table that think differently, that analyze stuff from that other angle, so that it's not all a single-threaded experience. I think that, for me, is probably tactically as a people manager, because fundamentally this is a people management type of issue. As a people manager, bring together folks deliberately that think differently, and that'll help to address that. And you can continue to work in your wheelhouse, right? Just like Dr. Bewley described with his pictures. Just find that Bill Verbort to come in and say, from a table perspective, this is what we need to look at as well. I think it's principally managed as a team builder and people management.
Great question. Thank you. One more question here. What's a farm's data worth to a provider to improve their tools? The question of value of this data.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a difficult question to answer because not every herd's data is worth the same. I think I would approach it from the standpoint of saying your data has value that certain technologies can unlock, right? And so it's not so much that your data is worth the same to each person, right? But what your data should be worth is a consistent ROI in the value you receive back, right? That's where I look at that equation, that cost-benefit equation as it pertains to data value. I don't think it's a scenario where we're likely to think about it as a revenue stream. I think it's much more around, as I share that data, what's the value I get back? And each stakeholder that you share that information with has a different value proposition. And you just need to decide what's the right ROI that I want to find. I think in my experience, the dairy cattle industry, again, because of our culture of records keeping, national coordinated genetic evaluations, DHI recording, et cetera, we tend to get along and collaborate very effectively and share that information because we clearly understand the value that's coming back. And I think leveraging that experience and that culture within our industry is going to be important in unlocking it moving forward. And again, I think the key then is understanding where those opportunities where you're getting a clear return on that willingness to share your data.
Thank you. Yeah, there was one comment here that was made earlier this week that your data is worth more than a pizza and a beer, so don't sell it for that. It has at least that minimum value, and ask for more from that.